Hey there, let's talk about agriculture and some basics here. And I have some questions here. So number one, why did people farm? Number two, what crops were these main crops? And then finally, where were these crops? So in regards to why did people farm, there's a lot of different reasons that have been speculated, from surplus crops to, hey, people preferred these crops and tended to cultivate them. But there's also another very compelling, somewhat offbeat one, that folks started to grow barley to make beer. Beer, it turns out, is naturally made if you were to leave, let's say, some barley in a vessel. It rained, it filled it up, started to sprout, and then it continued to rain. Yeast from the natural environment would be added, and then all of a sudden this brew would become fermented and have a slight alcoholic content, and it made people feel good, and so they kept making it. There's lots of evidence to suggest that we know early on that folks did make lots of beer. So that's one reason, and we talked about that in my cultural geography class. What crops did they grow? So for example, cereal grains in Mesopotamia, which is in current-day Iraq. Those crops would have been something like barley, wheat, rye, and other crops. And also there were those were seeds, of course. And then there were vegetative types of crops. A good example of that would be in southern China, Southeast Asia today. Things like bananas, yams, and so on. By the way, back to the seed crop, rice would have been grown in that area. I wanted to go through, again, some of these really basic staple crops. So here in the Americas, where did we have, let's say, maize? Maize is corn. Okay, so that's going to be in Mexico. In this part of Middle America is where maize or corn comes from. Of course, that's very important. The United States is like one of the number one growers of corn. And when we look down into Middle America, other kinds of crops would have been cassava. And down in Peru, we have the potato, right? So the potato is from Peru, the highlands of Peru, and of course that's very widespread throughout the world. And then there's soy and some other ones that are used every day for staples. Next, I want to talk about subsistence versus commercials. So let's take a look at the whiteboard on those two differences. Okay, I wanted to take a look now at the differences between subsistence and commercial. So in regards to subsistence, people are growing enough food just for their family, for people to eat. Okay, so consumption for your local family or your clan. On the commercial side, people are going to export that. Let's say they're growing rice, for example. They're going to export that. They're going to grow some of that for local markets, but it'll be a commercial venture for, of course, money. In China, where they're growing rice, for example, they'll use lots of manual work. They'll be using their hands. In the commercial side, people will be using tractors, plows, combines, which are used to harvest the hay, not the hay, the rice, and send that off into trucks to be stored into silos. So a very different approach here. You might have a 1,000-acre field here in the Sacramento Valley versus, an acre or so in, let's say, China. And then these are the less developed countries where we find subsistence agriculture. And these are the poorer countries, as I've written down here. And then over here we have the more developed countries. These are the wealthier countries that tend to have commercial agriculture. You should know that the one exception to that are plantations. So for example, if you're growing coffee in Costa Rica, or let's say bananas in Panama, these are American companies, let's say Chiquita, for example, that are growing commercial crops in the less developed countries, let's say Costa Rica, again, Panama. So now I want to take a look at some of the subsistence categories, kind of go down through them quickly, and then on the next video we'll go over commercial agriculture. Okay, so I'm back. I'm erasing the whiteboard here. And let's take a look at our first category. And let me grab my notes here. So then the first category we talked about was shifting cultivations. Okay, and this is a few things about the way I'm going to do this. Number one, we're going to take a look at what is the climate. So let me write that down here. And we use green. So let's take a look at the climate. Let's also take a look now at the human ecology. Okay, and what is that? Human ecology is basically the relationship of humans to the environment. So for example, with rice farming, rice seeds are put on by hand. People get barefoot. They go out there and spread the seeds by hand. The harvesting's done by hand. In, let's say, the United States, where they grow rice, near where I live, they fly the seeds on. They'll go in there a little bit by hand, but not really. They'll use tractors to harvest it, so it's very mechanical, very different relationship with the land. And then finally, I wanted to look at some key points. Okay, some takeaway points for each category. All right, so let's take a look now at the next and the first category, which is shifting cultivations. Okay, shifting cultivations, and I'll write that down. Okay, so basically, where is that? That's going to be in the tropics, right? So nice and hot and steamy. Okay, one of the things about the tropics is that it rains a lot, right? Okay, so when we get into the human ecology, what you want to know is, hey, what is the challenge here? And the challenge here is the soil fertility. If it's going to rain every day, okay, it might be, the soil might be fertile for a while there if you clear cut and you leave just some leaf litter. But after several years, let's say 5, 10, maybe 20 years, hey, the soil is going to be leached out. The nutrients will be basically drained away and, percolate into the ground deep where the roots can't get it. So that's the challenge right in here, is the soil, right? Okay, the soil fertility. Okay, so some of the key points then is that number one, these are going to be small areas. They will chop down the forest, let's say the Amazon rainforest, small acre field. They will then burn that brush, and that creates natural potash or fertilizer. And then after, let's say, 10 years or so, they're going to move on because the soil then becomes infertile. So small groups and large areas in the tropics. So that is shifting cultivation in a nutshell. They use natural fertilizer to keep that productivity up. Okay, moving on to another another category that is, where we have small groups and large areas in fairly marginal areas of the world. Okay, the next one is going to be pastoral nomadicism. And I think I'm using blue for up here. So pastoral nomadicism. Okay, and basically what is the climate right off the bat? This is marginal land, so this is going to be cooler and drier. For example, in Mongolia, where it's going to be cooler and drier. I have been to Mongolia. They grow a little bit of barley there, but as I recall, you're right on the edge of the Gobi Desert, and it's very cold there, I know, in the wintertime, and in the summertime, it was pretty nice, but generally speaking, the growing season's not long enough, and it's definitely naturally grasslands. So for starters, what's the challenge? Well, basically the challenge is this climate, right? How do they deal with it? Well, they basically raise animals. So yaks, sheep, for example, and then they will eat those animals. In places like Africa, they'll sparingly eat those animals. They'll eat grain instead. And so some key points are that it's small groups, arid, cooler regions, and what else? Oh, and they'll eat the animals and then grain, let's say, in Africa. Okay, I have written on the board now the next category, our third category, intensive subsistence, or just subsistence. And the category is intensive subsistence with wet rice dominant. And we focus just on this category because in Asia, in all parts of Asia, rice is so important. I remember when I traveled there to China and even Laos, folks eat rice every meal, in the morning, in the for lunchtime, as well as for dinner. And so for me as a Westerner, that was a little redundant, but nevertheless, it does answer a problem that has existed there for thousands of years. Remember, these civilizations are some of our oldest, for example, China. So if we take a look, first of all, what climate is this? This is going to be in tropical and subtropical. Number two, what's our challenge? What's this human ecology problem? And we're looking at something that can produce high yields and on small parts of the land. Okay, so how can you feed a lot of people? Remember, this civilization's been around for a long time, and rice has consistently become the answer. However, let's talk about the process, and it is fairly complicated. So let me erase this. Okay. So first of all, the number one process is it's very manual. There's lots of manual labor. Okay, in other words, it's labor intensive. There's a saying that we use here in the West that many people make little work, and that's definitely the case here. Okay, the second thing that I have in my notes here is that you must know they do use fertilizer. Okay, even though it may be sparing compared to what we use here, they do use fertilizer and they do use pesticides. And along those lines, they also, let's say, use irrigation. Okay, that's a big part of it. You look at any picture, let's say in China or in Indonesia, and these are terraced fields, a very complex set of irrigation channels that they use and so on. And then finally, and this kind of surprised me, they'll actually transplant the rice. So nursery stocks, looks like I got a spelling error here. Nursery stocks, there we go. And I found this amazing. So in the United States, they just, fly on the rice seed and then leave it alone. In China, they go in, they'll actually pull out rice that's, let's say, 1.5 feet tall, and then they bundle it up into these packages, go back out in the field, and spread it out, every foot or so. My assumption is that they do that so that the rice seeds itself will grow bigger because there's more space for the plant to grow. So it's a very complex process. Once they do harvest the rice by hand, let's say, they still have to thresh it. That is often done by hand, and then they have to dry it out, and then they get the hull off of it, and now you've got your rice. So it's a very complex process. So remember that for our key points. Next thing I want to talk about is intensive subsistence with wet rice not dominant. Okay, here's our final category on intensive or subsistence farming. And let's take a look here at the whiteboard. So I've written down intensive subsistence, no rice, in other words, other crops. And what is the problem here? Well, the climate and the problem are the same. And that is the climate is drier and cooler. Anytime you have a dry climate or a very cool climate, it's hard to grow things. One thing that does grow well there is grass. And what's about as close as you can get to grass are cereal grains. So let's take a look at what I've written down here. So first of all, that's the problem. When we look at the human ecology of this category, it's the climate. It's too dry and it's too cool. So some of the crops that can grow there are barley, which of course is basically it is a grass. Soybeans, corn can grow in these areas, especially if you irrigate it. And then wheat. Wheat's our number one crop in this category. Intensive subsistence with wet rice, not dominant. And the places where they actually grow the most wheat is China and India, where we typically think of them as eating rice. But yes, they do eat a lot of wheat in some of their food, and so they grow lots of that. So that concludes this mini lecture on farming and specifically looking at subsistence farming for cultural geography.